1938. So he's moved to Italy, and his son has taken over. But you can see how much more the shaping of the vistas and the presence of sculpture has transformed it into something distinctly more Italian. In Osbert's left-hand, right-hand memoir, it opens with a particularly vivid pen description of the garden at Renshaw, which, compared to his other descriptions of his father's weird eccentricities, cruelly laid bare, which are often quoted, I'd like to put this forward as a bit of an antidote. It's a much more affectionate and admiring picture. And he writes in this rather curious stream of consciousness manner, as if, I think, reminding us that his memoirs are based largely on childhood memories of a man who had to serve in the First World War. And he's looking back to this hazy but extraordinary period of the great country house in the 1890s, early 1900s. This is the pompous month of August, and the very early morning. Already, however, the light summer mists have evaporated and the distances are visible. And already, too, a tall man, fair and with a curious air of isolation, is out there upon the terraces. My father is fond of walking extremely rapidly in these gardens he has made. He walks up and down, surveying his work, his head full of projects, sun and shade, but never of flowers, measuring the various views with a stick to his eye or a pair of binoculars. And for projects such as these, though most of them never materialized, he would cause wooden towers built of planks and joists and beams to be erected here and there at the right points of vantage. In the summer, he would spend many hours aloft on these platforms. He made the great garden layout at Renishaw just before I was born, and I grew up year by year with its yew hedges. Indeed, though he has written many books, of which perhaps the best and best known is Happily Enough, a volume of essays entitled On the Making of Gardens, it is as an artist of levels and lawns and vista and lakes that he lives and will survive. Here is my very favorite part of Renishaw, which is just like this still today, known as the entrance to the wilderness, with the statues which they call Amazon and Warrior, and again from the Country Life 1938. But it brilliantly exemplifies that essentially romantic vision of Sir George, however rooted his writings are in an appreciation of that high Renaissance classical tradition. It was atmosphere he truly admired, and suggestiveness of vista and figure in the landscape, the appeal to the imagination. And all of this work, both in the garden, in the house, as patron and collector, was driven for Sir George by a sense of dynastic pride, a deep love of his family home. So I think it's important that we perhaps explore the story of this layered country house, just like so many English country houses are complex layered entities and not single era creations. The Sitwell family had long been owners in Derbyshire when they built their manor house we can see in the top left-hand image there in the 1620s, which remains visibly, oh, hang on, there is a thing, visibly still the core of the house today. There you can see it in the 18th century, 1793, a tall, storied, compact manor house. This is rather typical of the sort of Derbyshire manors, to be rather upright. The Universal Magazine, 1796, just as the house was being expanded in this Georgian Gothic style, described the house thus. This mansion is a good specimen of the ancient mode of constructing houses. The ground plan is nearly that of an H. The body is embattled, crenellated, and an old projecting tower, you can see in the middle there, is the principal doorway. But from the early 1790s, it was transformed into a much larger house, the result of a series of surprisingly piecemeal additions, which hugely expanded the overall envelope. And this more recent aerial view of the house gives a good feeling for the house as it grew, forming a considerably larger mansion house, spreading rather than compact and upright. 3 huge new rooms were added and a series of high-ceilinged bedrooms, and the whole exterior, including an older set of buildings serving as the servants' areas to the left of the picture. Remember, in this era, servants would be resident within the house. You needed a lot of accommodation and places for them to work. Was all wrapped round with a faintly Gothic Jacobean dress of finials and crenellation. And it's all done for Sir Sitwell Sitwell, we'll explain his name in a minute, the first baronet, using his local Sheffield carpenter-turned-architect with a resonant name of Joseph Badger, who in his interiors works in a late version of the Adam and Wyatt neoclassical style. Here is a ground plan of 1854, which clearly shows you the key rooms added by Sir Sitwell Sitwell. So Paul Sir Sitwell Sitwell, when he was born, was named Sitwell because he was a member of the Sitwell dynasty, but his surname was Hurt. And then the Hurts inherited the Sitwell estates, and they duly changed their surname to Sitwell. So Paul Sitwell was called Sitwell Sitwell. But he wasn't daunted by this, and he set about spending his Sitwell inheritance very energetically. And here you, oops, sorry, get back one, get the laser out. Here, so that's the old house in the middle, and you can see the low-ceilinged and the room with sort of 1620s plasterwork. This was opened up, but still low-ceilinged. And there is the ante-room to the dining room there, called the library here, or the great parlour historically, and that's the through hall. But you can see these three vast rooms, a dining room, a drawing room, and a ballroom of vast proportions that were added to him, completely transforming the character of the house. Things that he absolutely had to have. So this was the house that our Sir George Sitwell, came into on the ownership of his, into ownership of at the time of his majority, turning 21 in 1881. His mother had withdrawn to a house in the healthier air of the fashionable seaside spa of Scarborough, when her husband died, when George was only 2. And she had devoted herself to good works, the raising of her children, and the careful management of the Renishaw estate. So when her son did come into his inheritance, it would be not in the desperate state it was for her husband. And this was realized through both careful management, by not living a full country house life, but also by exploiting the mineral rights to their quite considerable landed estates, i.e. coal mining. And so by the time he came of age, he was a wealthy man. And then he set about making his own self-conscious marks on the house, on its architecture, and especially the garden. But remember, and I'll explain a bit more about this, this was driven not through just the traditional dynastic pride, but also for a sense of reviving the spirit of a house ravaged by financial disaster. But I'll say something about his architectural intervention first. One of the very first things he did was to give it a proper baronial Jacobean-style staircase in the 1890s, designed by F.W. Simpson in 1892, who was a pupil of G.F. Bodley, an architect he hugely admired. But he also responded, he wasn't just intending to turn it back into a Jacobean house, and he responded instinctively to all these great proto-Regency interiors created by his great-grandfather, and thought about them and revisited them in all their aspects, their colour schemes and their furnishings, introducing many Italian elements and debating the colours and details with advisors, including G.F. Bodley, Lutyens, and a J.L. Davenport, who might be known to some of you as the long-term manager of Watson Co. in London. Here you can see that both the dining room of 1795 and the drawing room of 1804, rooms which young Evelyn Waugh, visiting in 1930, one of the many young writers who stayed with the children of Sir George and on whom Renishaw made an impression, talks about the rooms of great beauty, fine tapestry and Italian furniture. These are the rooms, as I say, photographed in 1938, so after Sir George had moved to Italy, but they capture, I think, very much the rooms with Sir George's imprint on them. And for those who haven't been, here is the drawing room in the early 2000s when I published it in Country Life. So only a little change from that wonderful view. And rather interestingly, still with those key proto-Regency elements, those elements brought in to the house in the early 1800s, which rather remarkably include a William Chambers designed chimney piece, originally installed in Melbourne House in Piccadilly. Some of you might know it better as Albany, which it became, a smart set of chambers on Piccadilly, at which time they had a sale of things they didn't want, furniture and fittings, and this was when these chimney pieces and 2 others in the house were acquired before the works by Sir Sitwell Sitwell, along with the splendid Chippendale commode, which is actually on the other side of the room, but it will appear in a later photograph. And here is the great ballroom. There's the dining room as it's today. It's always been in a Etruscan pink, but that's a sort of more modern version of it. And here, the great ballroom of 1808 with distinctive Italian pieces. I thought the 1938 photograph shows the presence of Italian things brilliantly well, but they are still there. There's another, the Melbourne House chimney pieces in the ballroom above. And there, the splendid photograph of the Sitwell family with Sir George sitting on the fender, Lady Ida and his children, and indeed Reresby, who I knew, sitting on that great carved throne from Venice, which he felt he understood to be by the carver Brustolon. But of course not documented, like so many things acquired in that age. But those photographs, both the modern photographs and the 38 photographs, give the impression of a stately country home layered with generations of heirlooms and history. But this was one enhanced and cultivated by Sir George himself. Underneath it lay a story of 2 generations of misfortune and mischance, which heightened his own sense of the value and importance of his research and his collecting. Sir George's grandfather, another Sir George, the 2nd Baronet, inherited, after his extravagantly spending father's works, Sir Sitwell had spent extravagantly on the house, but he still inherited a fortune worth £12,000 a year, and through sheer bad luck, this ended up at no more than £700 a year. So he actually had to move abroad. Court case where he lost £40,000. He was defrauded of £35,000. In 1847, his bank failed just after he'd sold some land to try and spread all these debts. He was all but ruined. Renishaw shut up. Most of the silver pictures, furniture and books were sold off in 1849. Only that tapestry and a few other items, portraits in particular, remained as heirlooms. In 1850, he had to cut down most of the woods for the value of the timber. His daughter, Georgiana, recalled the dismal winter of 1853 she spent in the house just after his death. My father was dead, and the house had been gutted as if by a fire, and black plumes of mines were beginning to sully the air. She painted these charming watercolours, these interior views, as her memories of the house before the sales. She was looking back to a time, remembering what they were like, trying to record it and capture it in these paintings. Sir George's father, Sir Reresby, 3rd Baronet, inherited in 1853, an army officer in the Life Guards, but always overwhelmed by the debts of his father. And his firstly attempted to try and sell the estate, just to get rid of it in 1854, but couldn't find a buyer. Then he considered demolishing the additions put up by his grandfather, but somehow couldn't find the money to do that either, and lived in what were called bachelor apartments, looked after by one servant. Sir George's mother, Lady Sitwell, born Louisa Healy-Hetchinson, as a young bride, was daunted by her husband's miserable inheritance. Her father called the house a folly. In 1857, she writes of arriving at this solemn house, the wind howling through empty passages. Reresby tried to show me over it, thereby making me sadly confused in my head. And afterwards, I tried to explore alone, but could not get it done. Some distant door slammed, or the wind howled like a human voice, and back I ran. But a few days later, it was beginning to appeal to her. The grand old house, standing in full sunshine, looked as if it wondered how it could be left, dismantled and deserted. She had her 3 children in quick succession, Florence, George, and Blanche, and then tragedy struck. In 1862, Sir Reresby died. As I think I mentioned before, Lady Sitwell removed the family to Scarborough, and by reducing the family's outgoings and managing the estates carefully, was able to rebuild the fortune. It's a rather delightful picture of Sir George, his mother and sister, sketched by the Punch cartoonist Du Maurier, who was part of Scarborough society. Wonderful view of the interiors of Wood End, where they lived. There were hundreds of letters between Sir George and his mother, because she felt, although they were very, very close, she felt she must send him off to become the English gentleman. He was sent to Eton to board, and amongst those letters, quite a number of ones rather pitifully writing home, saying, "I am feeling dreadfully dull, please write soon." But she encouraged his interest in history and arts, and he gradually got into his stride at Eton, enjoyed friendships, sport, and writing skits. My first success, he says, was a volume of parodies, which we punningly called Parodies Regained. Get it? Paradise Regained. And we also learned during this period that he became interested in reading historical documents. So his mother, worried about the fact he didn't have enough masculine figures in his life, appealed to his great-uncle. Just imagine your guardian, when you're a little boy sent away to boarding school, is the Archbishop of Canterbury, who wrote constant letters of advice and inquiry about Sir George, often in haste, I have to say. As the historian reading them, they are almost illegible, because they're sort of obviously written at haste. And to give one of many sermonizing examples, on September 10, 1876, to Sir George, age 16, "If it please God to spare your life, you know that you will have many responsibilities to your people at Renishaw, and in every way to make good use of the money and position which God has given you, and also to be a comfort to your mother. But you will never answer those responsibilities without much self-control." To be fair, in 1856, within 5 weeks, 5 of Tate's own 9 children had died due to scarlet fever, so you can imagine the reference to being spared was a poignant one. Sir George would always answer his guardian dutifully, but to his mother revealed how hard he found this constant moralizing. October 5th, 1876, not that much later. "I hope I shan't have to go to Addington next holidays," the Archbishop's country residence. "It's like being sent to Siberia. Please, Mum." You know. He did go up to Oxford in typical aristocratic fashion, and equally aristocratic fashion didn't take a degree, but studied there and involved himself in various clubs, causes, hunted, rode, all those sort of things. He's actually made newspaper headlines exposing a fraudulent medium at a seance, and in which he took great pride, his second success after publishing Parodies Regained. Returning home, he does seem to have begun life as a responsible and dutiful landowner at Renishaw, an active politician, like so many landowners of his time, an ardent conservative and unionist. He contested the Scarborough seat 7 times against the Liberals, successful twice, representing the seat in Parliament from 1885 to 1886. In 1885, he was the youngest MP in the House. He must have felt some credit to himself getting there. And then again from 1892 to 1895. Later, he became a Liberal, but by then he'd effectively abandoned politics, perhaps feeling that he hadn't made a special mark in Parliament. And remember, this man who we will hear about his eccentricities later, was also a JP. He owned the local newspaper, quite useful if you're an MP, and was an officer in the local yeomanry. An important step, however, for a landowner filled with dynastic pride was to find a wife and produce a family. After a close relationship with his earnest, pious, well-educated, principled mother, he rather surprisingly chose to propose in 1886 to a beautiful but poorly educated young aristocrat who spent part of the year like them in Scarborough, the Honourable Ida Denison, daughter of Lord Lounsborough, later First Earl of Lounsborough, so she becomes Lady Ida in her own right in 1887. Her mother was Lady Blanche Somerset, a daughter of the Duke of Beaufort, and Osbert always thought that his mother's pedigree had mattered more to him, father, than their compatibility. There was a kind of tender devotion between them, but even setting aside the satirical quality of his son's memoir, it's clear that they were painfully ill-matched. He, 26, serious, industrious, scholarly, active, annoyingly punctilious, brought up in a frugal and moral household, and she, just 17, fun-loving, brought up in an atmosphere of luxury, with very little education, and indeed, as we'll hear perhaps later, had some sort of illness when she's young, which made things like mathematical calculation almost impossible in her head. And after a few years, given to extreme extravagance. Desmond Seward, in his book on Renishaw and the Sitwells, describes how she spent beyond her already generous allowance to such a degree that Sir George bailed her out of extra spending to the tune of over £20,000, which would be millions today. She was beautiful, hospitable, but it wasn't a happy marriage, although they remained together until she died, and on that day he wrote of the death of his darling Ida. So there was a strong connection. 3 children arrived quickly, and as you will know, they all had memorable careers as writers, the 2 eldest writing, as mentioned, rather merciless memoirs of their parents. Edith, nationally famous as a poet, later Dame Edith. Osbert, famous man of letters, including the biography, 5-volume biography, I might say, autobiography, a modernist poet, a champion of the avant-garde, and Sacheverell, later prolific poet, author, best known for his book on Southern Baroque art and British architects and craftsmen. but their lives are the subject of another lecture. Renishaw was also shaped by its many servants, most memorable of which was Henry Mote, butler and valet, who joined the household in 1893, butler by 1902, left 1913, but returned in the 1920s. Edith Sitwell described him as an enormous purple man, like a benevolent hippopotamus, with a voice like some foghorn endowed with splendor. But he was a figure of importance to the Sitwell children and served Sir George well, even though he left from time to time after heated exchanges. Even Sir George used to call him the great man, and he was Sir George's principal companion in Italy and learnt Italian so that he could serve his master there. Osbert reported that Mote, in retirement, wrote to him after seeing a reference in the press, Osbert publishing in his Who's Who's entry that he, Osbert, had been educated during holidays from Eton. Well, sir, wrote Mote, I may make bold to claim some of that, because whenever you were at Renishaw or Scarborough or abroad, if ever you or Master Sashi wanted to know anything about things on the earth, sea, or under the earth, or in the air above, you generally came to me, even when you had a tutor. And often the tutors came too. Lovely letter to get from your butler. Osbert's memoirs are peppered with absurd-seeming but believable stories of exchanges between Sir George and his butler. Henry, he called one day to the great man, I've a new idea. Knife handles should always be made of condensed milk. Henry looked particularly disgusted at the idea and very worried at its application. And then, with emphasis and with an unusual air of correctitude, he countered, yes, Sir George, but what if the cat gets at them? Just to give you a flavour, I'm not going to read them all out there, but these are accounts that Sir George gives about his interest in archives. An ancient house without its records is like a body without a soul and can never be fully enjoyed until one has learnt something of the men and women whom it has sheltered in the past, of their lives and manners, their love affairs, their wisdom and their follies. Elsewhere, he wrote poignantly, of family history, absolutely nothing had come down to us but the tradition that our ancestors had lived there since the reign of Elizabeth. And then he describes how there was a room called the lumber room where he was allowed to poke about on rainy days and could find the flotsam and jetsam that had been stranded there, old portraits, brocaded dresses, writing desks with letters, and a few old chests with manuscripts, and how he teaches himself to read ancient manuscripts during these rather solitary holiday pursuits. And they spawned all these rather erudite but unreadable memoranda and small books that he published on a multiplicity of subjects. The Oxford Dictionary of National Biography actually has this description of these many memoranda which filled 7 sitting rooms on a multiplicity of subjects over which his active, inventive, but erratic mind continually ranged, and upon which he expected to be consulted as an infallible authority. Sir George apparently had a sign written saying the following, I must ask anyone entering the house never to contradict me or to differ from me in any way, as it interferes with the functioning of the gastric juices and prevents my sleeping at night. His almost manic industry and perhaps that underlying melancholy we saw in those early letters home from Eton added to the anxiety and the unhappiness which followed his incompatible marriage and led in 1901 to a nervous breakdown. A local doctor is credited with suggesting maybe travels in Italy would be a cure. And from then on, he crisscrossed Italy twice a year in search of understanding of buildings and art and design. His itinerary is breathtaking. Even a couple of years later, he says, I'm feeling better, Mum, to his mother. Sorry, I'm feeling better, but I'm still worried about another breakdown when I come home. So these Italian tours became his route back to health, and he even writes about it in the introduction to his On the Making of Gardens, that this is why he started to travel in Italy. I've been going through these hundreds of notebooks, and particularly the Italian notebooks, and they're a vivid mixture of history, description, notes from books he's reading, sources for ideas for his own projects. So I've chosen some examples from 1905 and 6, just a little bit beyond that period of his most fragile health. In March 1905 in Rome, he's noting how the planning of the open loggia with a double entrance and the painted and plaster details might prove useful for future reference. In the Castel San Giuliano near Bracciano, notice the effect of embroidered borders on a plainer panel of hangings. A couple of pages later, he's writing, painted or gilt old Italian beds look good, however shabby. There are 3 good beds at the Castle of Bracciano worth copying. For indeed, with their painted and gilt furniture, as with bronze objects, a copy cannot be distinguished from an original. It's interesting how his mind is working, isn't it? In April 1905, amid his notes, including detailed measurements on the Villa Lante, I should do all the garden in box and earth and gravel walks, pots in borders on small stone bases, statues in the centre, a box parterre more austere than box mixed with flowers, but probably finer, and so on and so on. In Cesena, in November, library, in the church library, over the door, is a frieze between capital and entablature, black marble inlaid on white, good Renaissance, would do for a chimney piece. So it feels like he's always looking and thinking, what could he do for Renishaw, for the garden and the interior? I particularly like this one in Brescia in October 1905, two contemporary fakers of old paintings. Signor Corsi paints in the style of Tintoretto. Count Prospero paints in the style of Carpaccio. The latter paints on worm-eaten old panels. So I keep quite a good eye out at Renishaw if I can see any worm-eaten old panels in the style of Carpaccio. In Venice, 1906, not far from the church are some gondola posts with good Rococo achievements, i.e. the heraldic coats of arms. If I wanted posts for the lake at Renishaw, I should copy the post close to the Spanish pretender's house with tops like shellwork, and I should have them all green, except for the Rococo coats of arms, similar to those mentioned. In the same notebook back home, he's noting down discussions about colours with Mr. Davenport of Watson Co. His favoured harmonies for a room are blue and green and blue curtains, or vice versa, or in two reds taken from some picture. Bodley said two good reds. Bodley, too, says good reds will always agree, but they must be good, and one bad red will spoil the whole effect. He's really thinking about it. As a rule, avoid any reds with blue in them. Yellow walls are the best foil to black lacquer furniture. Green is the best background for white and blue and white china. And on it goes, page after page after page. Just to give you an example of his very intense handwriting and his sketches of details, and occasionally just jotting in the company he had at lunch at the hotel or wherever it might be. Eventually, all of these experiences and notes morphed into an idea for a book on the making of gardens, published in 1909. An extraordinary short book, concentrated, rich and profuse, focused on the great Italian gardens, Villa Lante, Villa d'Este, Palazzo Giusti in Verona, laid out largely in the 16th and 17th century, and yet becoming to him more beautiful in their antiquity, in their aged and overgrown encounter, if you like, with nature. The historian John Dixon Hunt notes the influence of the symbolist aesthetic and the many references to the magic and the music of the garden, indeed to Wagner in George's texts. Sir George described the beauty of the Villa Lante as a world possession, and its builder was like a great poet who has influenced the life of thousands, putting them in touch with the greatness of the past, lifting their thoughts and inspirations. In this, he seems to me to be expressing thinking about preservation that had yet to be articulated in that time in legislation and policy. His texts range from grand statements of philosophy: we should abandon the struggle to make nature beautiful round the house and should rather move the house to where nature is beautiful. To the house, the garden will be as intimately related, for it should be convenient, as if one was stepping from one room to another, and will often carry forward the main divisions or repeat the minor architectural features of the facade. But the first aim of the designer will always be to consult the genius of the place, to catch the music of the landscape and concentrate it by fitting foregrounds and the concealment of defects. So I showed you those early pictures of Renishaw Gardens. Interesting to see how well these last statements apply to the garden at Renishaw. He writes especially effectively about the placing of sculpture, so much so that I long to know what he thought about the placing of sculpture within galleries. Some of the lines are just deeply poetic. Softly the Triton mourns, as if sobbing below his breath, alone on the moon-enchanted fairyland of a deserted garden. But that's enough about the book. It's clear that while he visited hundreds of gardens in Italy, he also read widely, both in English writers such as Reginald Blomfield, but he also gives credit to two significant women authors of the time, Edith Wharton, for her fabulous book on Italian gardens, hinting that she's one of the few people to actually have addressed the issue of the principles of what makes a fine garden in Italy. And then Vernon Lee, I don't know if it's familiar to you, a prolific writer, resident in Florence at the time, pen name of a lady called Violet Paget. And he also quotes regularly in his book on gardens William James, the American psychologist, on the experience of beauty. His researches were often in the company of experts whom he sought out: Helen Zimmern, who lived in Florence, brought up in England, but a prolific writer on Italian subjects, both art and literature, and a friend and translator of Nietzsche, and Professor Bernanke, the inspector of ancient monuments of southern Italy, who gave Sir George considerable assistance. Indeed, his notebooks are peppered with references to either aristocrats or professors whose advice he has sought. Although, even when resident near Florence later on, with the exception of Arthur Acton, the father of Harold, he seems to have kept himself somewhat separate from those famous Anglo-American artistic circles around Florence at the time. His Italian gardens were clearly the inspiration for the garden at Renishaw. But then in 1909, he tips into madness and buys himself a castle in Italy, Montegaffoni. He wrote to his son, then at Eton, "You'll be interested to hear that I'm buying in your name the castle of Acciauli, near Florence and Siena. The castle is split up between many poor families, has an air of forlorn grandeur. It would probably cost 100,000 to build today. There's a great tower, a picture gallery with frescoed portraits of owners, and a chapel full of relics, so on, so on. The roof is in splendid order, and the drains can't be wrong because there aren't any." There he created this beautiful garden. Harold Acton said it had a poetical atmosphere entirely sui generis. He and Lady Ida moved there in the 1920s, partly in protest at increased taxation in the United Kingdom. He was resident there when war broke out and lived there until 1942, rather undisturbed, until the Bank of England would no longer send him money as he was in an occupied territory or an enemy territory, so his servants drove him to Switzerland, where he died in 1943 in a nursing home, the end of a full and unusual life. For the final section of this talk, I just wanted to return us to the Italian touches at Renishaw and just think a little bit about that patronage I mentioned before, his interest in furniture and paintings. How many boys at Eton were getting letters from their mothers saying, "Can I lend you a piece of old tapestry to go with the antique cabinet you've just bought?" In conversation with Lutyens, he said, "Should we do a room in the style of Aubrey Beardsley?" His Italian notebooks are full of references to colour, decoration, how a piece of furniture might work, and so forth. But to me, it's the most striking fact of his story is that he is patron of both John Singer Sargent and Edward Lutyens, the golden artists of the Edwardian age. Sir George had inherited a number of important portraits, to deal with Sargent first. This particularly lovely conversation piece, The Children of Francis Hurt Sitwell. So the tall boy in the riding boots and breeches is Sir Sitwell Hurt, later Sir Sitwell Hurt, later Sir Sitwell Sitwell. And the setting probably intended to convey their home just outside Sheffield. And then they come into the main Sitwell estates. And Sir George had a very proper dynastic interest in adding to the portraiture collection. He himself had sat to Henry Tonks and had his wife painted by William Blake Richmond. He writes to his agent, Peveril Turnbull, in 1899, "I feel now equal to paying for a large portrait group and wish you to ask your artist friend D.S. McCall whom he recommends." McCall suggested Jacques-Émile Blanche or Hubert Herkimer. But by June 14, 1899, Sir George has chosen his artist and wrote to Turnbull, "I believe I've settled with Sargent for next year. But there's many a slip. Sargent is very much the kind of painter McCall recommends, but he will only paint in his own studio in London and won't hear of a motive for the group or an outdoor picture and will please himself. It's evident, therefore, I cannot get the picture I want, namely a portrait group that will give information and tell its own story and will hang and mezzotint, i.e. be engraved, as a pair to the Copley. At the same time, Sargent is a great artist, and I shall get the best this age can offer." That is what he thought he was after, and I think he was right. What I'm afraid of is that Sargent hasn't studied the principles which have to be considered in dealing with portrait groups and art by itself, and that he will presently realise that 5 figures cannot be grouped without a motive. So by motive, I think he meant that kind of play or conversation that defines the mid-Georgian conversation piece, like the Copley. But then he concluded in his letter, "I have a good deal to do with artists and always get on well with them." Let's hope. He made elaborate preparations. There's a letter from Sargent agreeing in the archives. And he had the commode, which I mentioned came from Melbourne House, known as York House at the time it was sold. So that was the only identified piece of Lord Melbourne's furniture that is known. There's a recent article in Furniture History, and he sent down one of the diverse tapestries. And all of these items were careful. The china figures on the commode are lent by the dealer Duveen. All of these items quite carefully considered to evoke that Copley portrait, down to the riding boots. And the hat worn by Lady Ida, even though these are scorned in Edith's memoirs as absurd pretensions. Her father rarely rode. And why was her mother wearing a hat indoors? And why is her mother pretending to arrange flowers, which would always be done by the head gardener anyway? Children could be so hard. At the time, Edith was 11, Osbert 7, and Sir Cheverel 2. But Osbert wrote in his memoirs, though his father considered Sargent a very great painter, this in no wise relieved him of his duty as a patron, which was to offer an opinion on every matter, whether of taste, feeling, or technique. Sargent, he said, exhibited under this treatment a remarkable mildness and self-control. Osbert, however, includes the anecdote that a cruel remark Sir George made about his daughter's nose led Sargent to paint Edith's nose very straight and Sir George's slightly crooked. The Sitwell portrait was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1901, and one critic wrote, had the figures been as satisfactory as the cabinet and the tapestry behind them, the picture would have been a very fine one. Unfortunately, the figures, standing in curious isolation, have an odd appearance, difficult to describe, but suggestive of marionettes. Sargent had a copy. I think it's a fabulous painting, and when you go, I think you'll enjoy it as much as I do. Sargent had a copy of the Copley frame made at his own expense, and the painting was eventually sent to Renishaw. Oops, sorry. There we go. It was sent to Renishaw, and there it now hangs in the drawing room. But strangely, it never seems to have been hung as a pendant to the Copley. And Osbert wrote feelingly of this memoir, remembering being painted when he was 7, when he's publishing the book in the 1940s. The picture still hangs, I wonder for how long, in the house in which I write these words. Now, the ballroom here, where Sir George first hung the painting, you can see there, was, within a few years, to be modestly altered by no one less than Edwin Lutyens. Sir George himself, I think we've all established by now, was something of an architect and artist manqué himself. And in 1908, when he engages Lutyens, there's almost a feeling that he wants a professional companion, professional conversationalist on the subject. Lutyens, whose work I think Sir George must have spotted in Country Life, of which he was an avid reader, wrote in a letter to his wife, Lady Mary, in 1908, I have a vast apartment which is called the Duke's Room, named after the Duke of Devonshire, who stayed there, and I feel sure it is haunted, although they swear not. Sir George is very courteous and very civil and affects all things Italian, all that is Italian. Lady Ida seems a darling. She's under 40. They want me to do the garden, the ballroom, the billiard room, the great drawing room, the dining room, etc. The house is full of pictures, some quite good, some very good. Sir George wants me to build a little water palace, one room on a lake, which would be a delightful thing to do, and to build a house in Sicily, which would be fun. He's going to take me to Italy. It's very interesting to reflect on what might have happened at Renishaw had Sir George allowed Lutyens to fulfill all these dreams, all his own dreams. But to some extent, as Osbert Sitwell said, with the exception of the decoration of the ballroom and of the design of the unfinished pillared room next to it, even the earlier days that many alterations Lutyens planned for my father came to nothing. Nevertheless, year after year, my father would regularly start a new heir to be coursed by the famous architect. It's interesting to trace quickly the evidence for some of how these projects unfolded. Maynard Hollingworth, the sub-agent, writing in 1909, October, Mr. Lutyens has not yet sent the plans for the alterations to the ballroom and billiard room. He's working on them because he keeps on writing for detailed drawings of mouldings, fireplaces, etc. These I've supplied and we'll get on with the contract. In 1910, the agent, Peveril Turnbull, is writing huffily, it's a pity the ballroom work is hung up while you decide whether or not to alter the door between the ballroom and the billiard room. Perfectly absurd to hesitate, I should say. Just leave it alone and it will look all right. Meanwhile, these delays involve much increase of expense. So what I think was bothering Sir George was that this door is not central to the ballroom, but he was obviously thinking, should we change it by a few inches? And it was going on and on. Anyway, they continue, and the work is largely done. I think probably Peveril's letter had the desired effect. Things were largely complete in 1911, and Sir George wrote to his mother in that year. The golf club is a great success, another project, and so is Lutyens' treatment of the ballroom in indigo shot green curtains, so he wasn't just doing architecture, doing interior stuff, a Niger leather frame for the tapestry, and a margin of old piano keys. Yes? These are old piano keys. At least they weren't condensed milk. The most dramatic and successful change was to the billiard room, or the pillared room, which was the anteroom adjoining the ballroom, and a century after the ballroom had been completed in 1809. He gave the billiard room this new coved ceiling, you can see there. It's his colour scheme, the green, still there today. And this would have very considerably added to the experience of moving through these apartments. There were also some evidence that Sir George tried to persuade. So there they are in 1938. So you can see how it very much improved the approach to that great room beyond. And there's some evidence that Sir George tried to persuade, Lutyens tried to persuade Sir George to lose the bedrooms above the drawing room and create a coved ceiling in there, I think inspired by the double cube room at Wilton. They obviously had gone some distance because it was still being talked about in 1920 when he says he persuaded Lutyens to give up the idea. But I can see that he's trying to create a greater sense of grandeur in these rooms. There are various other little projects for that room. When the panelling you can see in the watercolour was taken to Italy, there was a design for an unexecuted golf club on Sitwell Park, and this was the Lutyens designed golf club for the Renishaw Hall estate, and this was the design he did for a garden in a house in the village, which is not unlike his layout for the garden at Heathcote in Yorkshire. And it's thought that this might have been a dry run for actually getting Lutyens to help him transform the main gardens in the house. Lutyens is still being asked his advice in 1920. Even in 1908, he'd written to his wife when he was asked about the gardens. He found Sir George rather sticky about the garden, as he isn't really an artist, but has seen a great deal too much. That whole page is Sir George writing down in his notebook advice from Lutyens on the garden. Writes it all out very carefully, thinks about it, and then disagrees with every single piece of advice that he's given. It's interesting to note that in 1911, with all of these great schemes in mind, and perhaps also his house in Italy, he sells his Perugino to J.P. Morgan. And as you know, that is in the Morgan Library now, in that wonderful study against the silk. I think in the Sitwell inventories, it's known as the Three Marys, but it isn't. It is, of course, Virgin and other saints. The sub-agent is horrified. Sir George has got too much cash. All the wild schemes, which were sold for £30,000, all the wild schemes which have accumulated for 15 years are to be carried out. White, the landscape gardener, was here several days, and Lutyens won. 3 lakes had been made in Eckington Woods Valley. A new drive and terrace had to be made through 12-acre plantation. The Ince-Piece Wood is to be reconstructed, a swimming bath to be made under the waterfall. The waterfall raised to 3 times its present height. A pavilion is to be built in the lake. Lutyens' idea is a stone ship. Sir George is talking quite seriously about this lot. Heaven help us if he does a tenth of it. There's some evidence that he was also thinking about rebuilding the whole north front of the house with a roof garden, again in this sort of Italian manner, which I'm still working, piecing that together. In concluding this talk, I'm just going to mention 2 further things. One is I should mention this terrible misfortune that befell the family when Lady Ida, who was given to great extravagance, great hospitality, but was always spending way beyond her allowance and constantly being bailed out. And things had reached a pitch where Sir George tried to resist these bailing her out to try and teach her a lesson. And this led her to fall into the hands of an unscrupulous moneylender who used her in the First War to entrap some of Osbert's fellow officers to take money loans from this particular man. And she was put on trial with him for conspiracy to defraud and sentenced to a period of imprisonment. Terrible shock to her family. I mean, there's no doubt that she had involved herself, but evidence was given that she actually had this illness when she was young that made actual mathematical calculation impossible. And poor Sir George, having felt that he'd let her down, writes to the Home Secretary a 12-page document listing all these things, saying that she was an easy target for deception herself, not capable of calculated fraud. But they stuck it out, and they were together till the end. But I suspect it might have influenced the decision in the next decade to move to live permanently in Italy. When the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography entry, written, it turns out, by his son Osbert's long-term partner, David Horner, says in 1925, Sir George left England to make Montegaffoni his residence, persuaded thereto by his 3 children, who needed freedom to follow their own brilliant careers. Whether it's true or not, they all became prolific and admired authors, and perhaps owed much more to their father's interest in research, history, people, art, and architecture than is often allowed. They became true celebrities, champions of the avant-garde, allies and then splendid enemies of the Bloomsbury Group. Much has been written on them all, which I can commend to you if you haven't read it, and I hope my researches into the life of their remarkable, if unusual, father will add depth to those portraits of those talented children as well. One final anecdote. Oh, there's the children and their famous works. One final anecdote told about Sir George, and one often taken as evidence of the entrenched snobbery of the English upper classes, is the letter written in 1942 by Evelyn Waugh, looking back to a visit in the early 1920s before they had moved to Italy. I remember him most particularly as I saw him one evening just before dinner. We'd all come out onto the terrace to enjoy the beauty of the sunset, which was breaking through the mist and was lighting up the opposing hills. Your father was wearing a long-tailed evening coat with a black waistcoat, as though he'd gone into mourning with the court many years before, had taken a liking to the style and retained it in deference to some august and secret bereavement of his own. He seemed slightly estranged from the large party you and Sashi had invited, and edged away to the extreme fringe of the group where I was standing, and stood silently, gazing out across the valley. In the valley at our feet, still half hidden in the mist, lay farms, cottages, villas, the railway, the colliery, and the densely teeming streets of the men who worked below. They lay in shadow. The heights beyond were golden. Your father had seldom addressed me directly during my visit. Now, since I was next to him, he turned and spoke in the wistful, nostalgic tones of a castaway, yet of a castaway who was reconciled to his solitude. "You see," he said, "there's no one between us and the Locker Lampsons." As an entrenched landowner, he could only see himself in relation to the nearest neighbouring landowner and not to the rest of the world who lived in the valley below. The story is simply too good to be true. And the house, collection, and garden all go on. The whole estate remains in Sitwell family hands, having passed from Sir George to his son Sir Osbert, then to his grandson, Sir Cheverell's eldest son, Sir Reresby Sitwell, who died in 2009, aged 81, but whose wife, Penelope, Lady Sitwell, famous beauty and renowned hostess of the later 20th century, has just celebrated her 102nd birthday. With Sir Reresby, as I mentioned before, I discussed those 1930s memory of Sir George, and with Lady Sitwell remembering her first visits to a house with no electricity. I remember her saying how Edith handed her a candlestick to go up to bed and told her the number of steps that she had to go to get upstairs without tripping over. And now the house is owned and run by their daughter, Alexandra, and Rick Hayward, her husband. And it is to them I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity to research the life of Sir George more deeply and share with you something of the story of Renishaw Hall in the age of Sir George. And remember, the house is waiting for your visit. Do go. Thank you very much.
If anyone has a question, we'd be happy to hand you the microphone. Questions for Jeremy? He can't possibly have answered everything you wanted to know about Renishaw Hall.
Oh, there's so much more. There's so much more.
Anyone? Well, I see you're eager to continue your conversations and good cheer. So off to the reception we go.
Perfect. Thank you so much.